lose the impact of how despised the Samaritans were and the oxymoron of putting together good and Samaritan together. How could a Samaritan be good? You know, when we fill in the blank in our context now. So it's about this paradigm shift. And it's about the bigger lesson that the lawyer tries to circumscribe and limit the definition of who's included as neighbor. And Jesus responds with a story about how your worst enemy is extravagantly being neighbor indiscriminately to everyone, and then go and do likewise. So Jesus is very clever, challenging all kinds of boundaries. So I've always been suspicious of this story. I'm not the person to ask about how do you feel about being in the kitchen cooking. My lowest grade was home economics because it was a required course only for women. I didn't like that. So we've been suspicious about it and wondering, thousands of years ago, this was a story that was told, and how easy it is for us to miss the message. I think we've turned Mary and Martha into this cautionary tale. Like, is Martha being put down because she's fussing, because she's so busy, because she's stressing out, or she's not being a cheerful giver? There's the Deuteronomy quote that Jesus knew so well as a rabbi, as a teacher, as a lover of his Jewish scriptures. Man does not live by bread alone, but the sustenance of the living God, the foundation. And what if the better part, the main course that Jesus is talking about, isn't what we think it is? So the context, this story, and we're going according to the lectionary, so it immediately follows last week's story, Jesus' parable about the good Samaritan. It's a revolutionary tale in the context of that time about a despised outsider who crossed boundaries to save a stranger's life. A stranger who despised people like him. Now Jesus arrives in Bethany, and we encounter another story about crossing boundaries. But this time, the boundaries are gender lines, and the revolution is happening inside the house, specifically inside the kitchen. Martha is in the kitchen, transforming raw ingredients into a love offering. Reminds me, any of you see the movie or read the book like Water for Chocolate? Magic realism from Mexico and South America. It's an alchemy, an ancient alchemy. And Martha is a master practitioner. She knows that hospitality is a sacrament, and that feeding people in itself is a form of prayer, like our mothers and our grandmothers knew. But let's be clear about what Martha's shouldering. She's not just providing for Jesus and Mary and herself, it's Jesus and his 12 disciples. So that's at least 13 large, hungry men. And in first century Palestine, this represents several days' wages and back-breaking labor. And Martha, it's unusual. She appears to own this house, which is unusual for a woman. She's a woman of means. She's navigating a world where women rarely had such independence. And she's also, with that independence, hosting a troublemaker, Rabbi Jesus, an itinerant teacher that's causing a disturbance, according to Rome and Herod and Pilate. But Martha here is alone in the kitchen while Mary sits at Jesus' feet. And somewhere between the chopping and the dicing and the stirring and the mixing and the heating up, Martha's sacred work becomes too heavy a burden for her to bear alone. And so here's what I notice. Jesus' 12 male disciples have vanished the moment domestic work appears. Where are Peter and Andrew? Where's James and John, those sons of thunder with all their opinions? It seems like it's a magic trick that men have been performing for thousands of years, don't you think? So how many of you have stood in Martha's kitchen? And you know the exhaustion of cooking for a crowd while everyone else enjoys the party? And how many of you have sat in Mary's spot, knowing the courage that it takes to choose contemplation or listening, and also feeling the pressure of that other person bearing the responsibility? I think the tragedy to me is that not that Martha chose service or that Mary chose learning. I think Cheryl said it pretty well. It's like both and also the tragedy that these two women had to choose it all and that they were pitted against one another, it seemed, in the story. Where are the men? So I played with this. I tried to fantasize, as some of you would, were doing, like, what would you have done? What would you have told Jesus? So try to imagine this, and this is really hard to imagine in the context of that time because this was very patriarchal. Jesus, the fact that he even had Mary sitting at his feet, that was revolutionary. And he didn't say, go out in the kitchen and help your sister. So think about the context of that time where women were property. Women didn't really have rights. What would have happened if Martha looked straight at Jesus, right in the eye, and said, you know what? I'm choosing that better part too, the main meal. What if she wiped her hands on her apron and she plunked herself right down next to Mary? I see some enthusiasm. I bet Catherine would have done that. Yeah, and Sheila. So picture the scene. There's awkward silence, 12 disciples shifting uncomfortably. Someone's stomach rumbles. The bread dough is still rising. The fish is still uncooked and it's starting to get warm, and there's this, shall we say, pungent odor. And the disciples are looking around, thinking to themselves, but not saying, did Jesus just talk himself and the entire crew out of dinner? Thanks, Jesus. I love this scenario because it exposes, could it have been a trap for Jesus that he set himself up for? Telling Martha, what is he telling Martha? Get back there in the kitchen? Or is he telling something else, like, your sister has courage? Because spiritual nourishment is equally, if not more important. But we still need to eat. So what do you imagine that Jesus could say in this imagined story 2,000 years later? I imagine Jesus standing up and saying, come on, boys, let's all prepare this meal together. We can learn a lot. I can picture it. Peter fumbling around with apron strings. He says, I know so much about knots as a fisherman, but he doesn't really know about knots when it comes to the kitchen. Or John, who's the mystical disciple that always talks about, I am the bread of life. I am the wine, I'm the vine, you are the branches, talking about Jesus. And he's kind of in that mystical place, looking at the bread, and he kind of forgets about what he's doing, and the flat bread is burned. Or Thomas is doubting, doubting Thomas. He's like, does the stew have enough salt? No. Maybe more pepper? No. Maybe more carrots? No. Maybe more garlic? And Jesus is teaching everyone about the miracle of how you chop onions without getting tears. But that's not the story we have. The story we have is Jesus recognizing perhaps Martha's distraction comes not from too much work, but from too little self-worth that renders her to believe her only value is there in the kitchen and maybe people will like her, that she's only a servant. And perhaps the one thing needed is not the opposite of service in this case. The one thing that's needed is the foundation that makes service possible, which I think we and so many progressive faith communities that care about social justice sometimes forget. The deep knowing that we are beloved, that we are God's beloved, the deep knowing that we need that nurture every hour, every minute, every day. That is the prerequisite. That is what allows the energy. We are beloved before we're useful. And I think this knowing, it's structural. It's a paradigm shift. Then and now, this knowing requires communities willing to restructure themselves so that everyone can experience this kind of belovedness. You know, I'm so happy about this Sunday because we had co-hosts this morning, Carl and Sheila, in the kitchen. It might mean asking, are we in a pattern? Who usually sets up the coffee? Who cleans up afterwards? But this Mary-Martha dynamic of women pitted against one another, it happens in a lot of churches. Churches can be very tribal. They can be holding on to traditions that might not make sense anymore. I mean, how many churches still don't allow women to preach? You know, I mean, there's something about the God is still speaking that needs to inform our faith. We need to participate in it, just like we need to participate in democracy. We're participants. But the Martha-Mary dynamic extends far beyond sanctuary walls. In Oakland, we see it in the women who run local food pantries while men chair their boards. Or mothers juggling part-time jobs to pay for crushing rents while fathers are praised for babysitting their own children. Or immigrant women who provide so much support. Low-wage workers, helping in households, helping in hotels, helping in restaurants, while being told they should be grateful. So consider your dinner table. Who planned the meals, bought the groceries, did the cooking? Who will clear the dishes? Consider how in our country we have teachers and nurses, disproportionately still women, called essential workers, especially during COVID, but then treating them and paying them as if their work were optional. So I think the genius, to me, the genius of the story here is how it reveals that the problem isn't individual. It's both and. It's personal choice, like Mary was making a radical choice for herself at the time. And Jesus welcomed it. Maybe Martha needed a bit more love to do that for herself too. But it was structural because the society expected the women to be in the kitchen, and so they were pitted against one another. So Martha's anxiety wasn't a personal failing, but it's a reasonable response to an unreasonable, impossible situation. She wanted to be there listening too, and they had to eat. Until we address the systems that create modern Marthas, our spiritual platitudes of self-care become another way of telling exhausted people that their burnout is their own fault, and they're fussing about many things. But something we might forget also about this early movement was just exactly how radical it was. The early followers of Rabbi Jesus were men and women, and women's voices were valued. Women hosted. Some women sat by the feet and listened. And Rabbi Jesus and the followers, the early movement, understood there is beloved community when everyone gets to be both Mary and Martha, everyone. To knead the bread and to break the bread, to ask the questions and to listen to the answers. What does this vision look like in our lives? Like partners who share domestic labor, workplaces that value care work as much as profit margins, communities where the people who keep us fed and housed can also afford to live in those communities. So how do we imagine resurrection now? I picture Jesus in kitchens around Jerusalem, helping prepare meals that would sustain the early movement. Reminds me of the breakfasts that were being made here in Oakland by the Black Panthers before schools, because there were some kids that didn't get food, and it's men and women. And how do you learn if you don't have that physical sustenance? I picture Mary and Martha and the male disciples working side by side, the sacred work of being whole, finally within reach. Because I think that's what this story is about. Not choosing between contemplation and action, but claiming our full inheritance as children of God, beloved enough to rest, trusted enough to serve, whole enough for both. It's questions for our journey. Where in your life do you need to claim your full inheritance? Where have you been playing Martha where you need to be Mary? Where have you been sitting in Mary's spot while someone else carries the weight? What's one small step that you could take this week toward the sacred work of being whole? Perhaps it was too much in the context of that time for Martha to do the most radical thing, to sit down next to her sister and claim her place as a student, to challenge the entire community on her own. And perhaps that's what we need to welcome and invite more of within ourselves and the most vulnerable ones now, to challenge communities to reckon with what happens when the people who do the essential work stop working and start demanding their full humanity instead. Maybe the better part isn't choosing between Martha and Mary at all, but insisting that we all get to be both. Amen. And we'll now hear our sermon response.